Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be the ultimate truth.
Hi, folks. Hope you're having a good Labor Day. We are here laboring, of course. This is Rick Wagner getting it right here on KNZZ, KGLN, 980 and 101.3 on KGLN, and 1192.7 on KNZZ, on the internet and podcasting, and who knows what else. Anyway, since it was Labor Day, I thought it would be good to start off with what's being done with your labor. Right? Because you labor, you get paid, at least we hope so, and the government takes part of that to generously provide for you things that you don't even think you need. Where's that headed? And what about them as a fiscal policy? That is the government. So I decided to look up a little bit about the national debt and how much it's consuming. And I'll tell you one thing, and when people are talking to you about this, or you see it on the news, you got to kind of listen, because if I say, what's the percentage of interest payments that we make on the national debt every year? That's a portion of federal revenue. In other words, all the money they take in from you and I. That's one number. If you say expenditures, what percentage of the expenditures, period, that the federal government will make in such a year, and have it figured that way, it's going to be different. And of course, why is that? Well, it's going to be different because we spend money we don't have, which is why we're making interest payments. So we spend more money than we collect. I don't say we. Politicians at the federal level spend more money than is collected. So if you ask how much of the revenue they're getting, in other words, how it's balancing out with money they actually get, that's one number. If you want to know what percentage of it is in terms of what they're spending, period, which includes borrowed money or printed money in some instances, then you get a different number. So you need to listen to what they're saying. It's just a whole statistics thing, where you can break it out almost any way you want if people aren't listening and say, wait a second. Revenue is one thing and expenditures are something else. Because the people that are saying this assume that you, in your real life, can't overspend that much because you can't print money. You can borrow it, though. That's true. You could have more of an expenditure spent. You could probably have more expenditure than you have revenue. Like if you borrow some money in a year or something like that. It's really kind of a different thing, though. This we're talking inside of a global thing about the government spends entirely on all of its programs and so forth. Revenue is something I think is interesting because it's the money they actually have. So what are they doing with that, right? Well, I looked this up and got a little bit on it. In 2025, that will be this year, interest payments are projected to consume about 18.4% of all the federal revenue connected. So all the taxes you're paying in, 18.4% of that is going just to service the debt. If we stay on this trajectory, by 2035, it's going to be 22.2% of all the money that's collected. If the interest rates stay higher, so they have to pay more than what they figure they're going to, you could see the number get up almost 30% by 2030. That's a lot of money. For instance, this year, well, no, not this year, because we have to go back next year to get the actual numbers. May of 2024, if you go just to May of 2024, last year, the interest on the first 7 months had already exceeded the defense budget and Medicare. It was $514 billion on the that they'd spent so far on interest in 2024 by May. They'd spent $498 billion on defense and spent $465 billion on Medicare. All right. So that means that roughly during this time, the interest expense is like $678 billion. That is frightening. And what does it kind of mean? Well, we all know what it means. You people understand what it means to live without your means. But it's a little, imagine, you're living in a household and you have a fixed amount of income. Now, this is different for government because they have a fixed amount of income, but they pay no attention to it. They just print more money or borrow it from somebody else. Sometimes you, sometimes foreign countries. But in a rational world, the household would have a certain amount of money to spend. Well, if you're spending 14, 18% of your take-home pay, as it were, just to service your credit cards, mind you, that's not really paying down your debt. That's just the interest payments on your credit cards. That's eating pretty good into what you have to spend on, I don't know, maybe your house payment, maybe getting a car, maybe going on vacation, maybe saving up for retirement, something like that. That eats into it pretty fast. The federal government has that going on with your money, and it doesn't seem to have the same concerns you might if it was your money that you were just paying interest on out of your pocket every month or every year. That's why it gets so alarming and confusing because, yes, it is alarming, and it gets confusing because they throw the figures around between revenue and expenditures and stuff like that. But the reality of it is, if you look at it in money they actually have, it's a lot of money. It's, 18.4%. It's less, I want to say it's like 14 or something percent of the money that they spend, expenditures. Which means if you think about it, that difference is kind of borrowed money they're spending, right? If they're only have 18.4% of the revenue, and yet on their expenditures, they're spending 14.4%, that means they're spending a significant amount of money that they didn't take in. In some sense, it's not real money. If it's printed money, it could be borrowed money. If it's borrowed money, it just increases the debt. If it's printed money, it just lowers the value of all the money that's in circulation because now there's a bunch more money circulating around that the Fed has printed. So it's essentially part of your labor. You work, you pay taxes, and then this is how they distribute them. Now, sometimes it seems like it'd be a better idea not to have government, but of course we know that isn't true. There's a purpose for government, and very serious purposes for government, but it's gotten lost. The main things that we think government ought to be doing seem to be secondary or tertiary here. Like, for instance, shouldn't we first be providing for the national defense, then maybe personal protection, law enforcement, and so forth, and then providing some for Medicare, Social Security, things like that have always been promised, but at least trying to take care of the big things, building roads, for instance, actually building rail systems, unlike California, who I believe that high-speed rail system has ballooned from about $30-some billion to $123 billion, something like that. The Trump administration is finally cutting back on sending them money from the federal government because I think that rail system is supposed to be finished by 2020, and it's not even got a rail laid. It's got some weird sort of skyscraper-y looking monoliths and nothing really connected to them. It's been sitting there for a long time. They've also changed where it was going to go. It's now going, I think, it was originally going to go for, what they wanted to do originally, wanted to go from Los Angeles to San Francisco. Well, that proved to be no way to do that because they couldn't get the rights to the land to drive over that. So then they started cutting it back, and I think it ended up Merced to Bakersfield, and I think they even cut it down lower to that. So if it did work, you'd have a high-speed rail to places that people don't spend a lot of time. Okay, folks, thanks for sticking around. I appreciate it, especially when you're talking about something kind of depressing, like the way the government spends your money. But since it's Labor Day and your labor is where that money comes from, I mean, that's how that works. The sweat of your brow, and some of you guys sweat a lot about working outside or doing some things that are not easy work, and yet it seems so easy to spend it when it's not your money. Apparently, that's the way government works. But we understand that's a problem with it. We just have to keep it in control, and it's, by the way, not in control anymore. So we were talking a little about this, the interest payments and so forth in the last segment. So if you look at the trajectory we're on now, the interest payments, if we don't do a few things, and President Trump's trying to do a few things, which may impact this, but it's such a leviathan, lumbering out there that it's not easy to stop. And you may have noticed that people in government aren't very helpful about what he's trying to do. I was trying to think of anybody he's tried to fire, really, who hasn't claimed that he can't fire them. Let's see, we had, I think the NPR, we had this Lisa Cook, the last one on the Federal Reserve. That's an interesting one because it's unclear if you look about how much firing authority that the president has over people on the Federal Reserve. It's a little hazy, in other words, about, the kind of conduct that he can engage. He can't just fire you without cause, rather. He has to have something specific, be able to do that. And it's not been done very much. So, of course, we're going to end up in the courts with this. She's not going to go quietly into that good night. I think we know that. And several of them have been like that. You may remember when Doge was first going on that they were locking the doors of some of the agencies so they couldn't get in to examine their books. And they were blocking the doors with their desks. And, that is not a sign of someone that thinks they're doing a good job. So this is something you have to address periodically. I just think that the government is like anything else, that at certain points it needs a very serious reformation. It doesn't mean that everything has to spiral down to, Venezuela kind of things. You just have to, redo it. It's the same kind of thing I always talk about with revised statutes in Colorado, and really most of the statutes in the states and the federal government for that matter too. We used to revise them. In other words, go through them and take things out that were not applicable anymore and try and resolve inconsistencies between parts of them. We don't do that anymore. They do a little bit, but mainly, in the states especially, they just write new stuff. And you end up with conflicting imperatives that you have to do. For instance, like there's a bunch of things in the Colorado statutes about the court is supposed to prioritize certain types of cases. Well, there are several things they're supposed to prioritize, but it doesn't tell you what the priority of the prioritized things are. So what are you supposed to do with that? Just do it in your own head, I guess, because they don't give you any guidance. There's 5 things, well, which should come first? I mean, it seems like a simple thing, and it is a simple thing. If you just go back through and say, hey, we need to, harmonize this, as it were, right? No, it just doesn't happen. I mean, Colorado, for instance, the revised statutes, we say revised statutes because they used to be revised every 10 years. Well, we haven't revised them since 1973, so we just keep stacking them up. I sent a picture out, about 2 years ago, where I had a stack of the statute books that I had from 2 years ago that I was getting rid of out of storage, and then the new ones. And I stacked them up to each other. And, there's in 2 years, there's another book of stuff. And in the meantime, there's stuff in there that just, when you read through it, you go, what? The juvenile code is terrible. It's all over the place like that. And things in the statutes are scattered all over places. You would think, well, there's the criminal code and this and that. Yeah, kind of. But then there's other things scattered throughout the statutes that just got fired in there. Nobody does anything about it. Now, the inefficiency of that is one of the ways that government loses money, right? Because everything it runs on instructions like statutes, rules, whatever those may be. When they're difficult to understand and conflicting. It's what most people would call in a business inefficient. And a business would go out of business, or they would find the person that was doing this and get rid of them. This is not what happens. If you think of all the things that you've heard about in just the last year, and then try and find how many of them that were just absolutely ridiculous and troubling, and go back and see how many of them actually went away, yeah, it's not going to make you very happy. I mean, Ronald Reagan did say that the closest thing to immortality was a government program, and he was not far off. As a matter of fact, speaking of Reagan, I mean, you can go back, and I have someplace, I should find it again, and you can find it now, it's on the internet, but like 10 years ago, I had a copy of Reagan's speech from 1963, the Time for Choosing speech. Really good. And when you listen to that, if you just take some of the numbers he's talking about and inflate them by 20 times, and there's a few references to people in there that you may not remember, but for the most part, it sounds like he's talking about things today. And this was the start of people becoming really concerned about the budget and the way government is being spent. And compared to the way we spend it now, that was just as tight a little purse that somebody could have in comparison. You can't even imagine. It'd be like it was tied up and you have to spend 20 minutes untying it to get money out of it, compared to the way we spend money now. And it was becoming a problem then. That's a great speech, by the way. And I played it on the radio, I don't know, like I said, about 8 or 9 years ago. I just, on one of the longer segments, when I was doing 2 hours, I played the whole thing. It's in the public, it's in the public sector now. And so, and it's interesting. And you forget, and many of you listening out there, weren't around or not really paying attention during the Reagan presidency. Because if you go back and look at it, it's really instructive. Because so many of the things that are leveled at Trump were also leveled at Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan was a lot easier going guy in terms of communication than President Trump, who has to, kind of double down on these things to get anything done. And there's just, if you go back and look at stories, I mean, he was gonna blow up the world. He was, he was crazy. It's just, and really, any Democrat talking about a Republican president, really in the last 25 years or more, that's pretty much what they say. It's amplified with President Trump because he does more things and he doesn't care. And he makes it clear that he doesn't care. Ronald Reagan didn't care very much either, but he didn't address it. Trump will come out and tell you what a stupid idea that was, and that you're a loser, and that you shouldn't have even been talking about this. That has a tendency to rile people up, particularly people who make their whole living or their whole lifestyle based on just sort of jingoism from the left, right? Now, many of you know that the DNC had a meeting in Minneapolis, and it was hilarious. I mean, I've seen clips of it. Some of the statements from people there, first of all, you'd want to go, what country are you talking about? According to them, we are living in like one of the most racist, fascist countries that's just ever been around, and that we are just in danger of slipping into some sort of, something out of Lord of the Rings kind of evil. It's like, what are you talking about? This is why these lunatics out there, do things like this horrible lunatic in Minneapolis was shooting the church. I mean, these people are on the cliff's edge of crazy anyway. Well, they're really crazy. It's just they haven't actually been turned on. And this kind of stuff makes it seem like, oh yeah, well, I see that. I mean, I'm a warrior for the whatever you fill in the blank from all this rhetoric. And it's something else when you start listening to it. I mean, like I said, a lot of this you heard with Reagan and certainly with Bush and a few things like that. But the amplitude of it right now is really troubling. If you spend any time, and I don't recommend it, watching MSNBC, you'll come away a little confused about, wait, what country are they in? And then about how are these really solutions? Because there's no solutions. There's just anger. And, get rid of this, get rid of that, attack that. This is the end of democracy. I'll tell you, I just wish someone would give me like a dollar bill every time one of these morons says, protecting our democracy. Because it just goes on and on. I don't think they have the slightest idea what they're talking about. Why doesn't somebody question them, by the way? Why'd say, well, that's an interesting thing. What do you mean, our democracy? How do you define that? What do you mean by that? I suspect that most of them would give you the deer in the headlights look, because it's just rhetoric as far as they're concerned. They haven't given it any thought. You folks out there, kind of the stuff we do here and that happens on talk radio and a few other conservative things, you actually think about stuff, and you understand what you're trying to say and why you're saying it. If somebody asks you, what do you mean by that? You know what you mean by that. A lot of what goes on now from the left is hysteria. And when you're trying to find out what they mean, they don't really know exactly what they mean. It's just a feeling. And that's not any way to propose it. Okay, folks, thanks for sticking around with us. So what is all of this discussion about how money's being spent and how our government is putting us, and it is us, into debt, and how fast it's going, and the way that it sort of gets manipulated in the figures and so forth to make it seem like, oh, that's not that big a deal. Well, it is a big deal, and we're starting to realize that now. And like I said earlier, we were talking about this in 1963 with Ronald Reagan to some extent. So certainly Barry Goldwater was. So it's not like it hasn't been around. But the question is it so round, speaking of being around, that it's rolling downhill and we maybe can't stop it? There's too much debt, right? Well, that's not true. You can always stop that. The problem is, will people let you? Because all of this debt we're spending is wrapped up in spending much of it, as we know, entitlements, things of that nature, and you have to monkey around with those. And anytime we do that, the Democrats say that we're trying to do away with this, or we're throwing grandma over the cliff in a wheelchair, or whatever the things that comes up. But, of course, that's not it. It's like the Medicaid idea you've been hearing about, where the Democrats say that, oh, Trump's trying to get people off Medicaid. What he's trying to do, first of all, is limit Medicaid to people who are legally in the country. I mean, the fact that doesn't resonate and say, oh, yeah, well, that's something that easily, I understand that. And that's not what's happening. I mean, he's brilliant in the one sense that he has cornered the left, particularly the far left, into this 80-20 argument all the time. I know we hear the 80-20, but it really is kind of true. Some of these topics, 70%, almost 80% of the country thinks one way, and the radical side of the Democratic Party thinks another. And sometimes it's just because it's linked to something else. And they can't give up this because they think that it affects that. And it puts them in really ridiculous situations. You end up being in El Salvador having a margarita with a person that's in prison from United States deportation, right? The fact that it is a problem to get somebody illegally out of the country, and that you have all these people trying to stop you, who would have thought that was going to happen a few years ago? I saw where they're trying to indict a couple of hospital employees when let's see, is it Maryland? I can't remember right in the top of my head. But apparently ICE was in the process of pursuing an illegal, and he ran into this hospital, and then a couple of the employees of the hospital tried to shield him from the ICE agents, tried to, hold him back, put him in a room, stand in the doorway. There's quite a little tussle going on there. Why? I mean, they don't even know him. They don't know what his circumstances are. They don't know why they're trying to deport him. They don't know why the ICE police, that's what they are trying to catch him and do so. They know nothing. So what's the driver there? Well, it's opposition to the authority. And why is it opposition to authority? Because it all goes back to this hatred of Donald Trump. Really, it powers this stuff. They see INS. Well, we don't really have INS anymore. They see Homeland Security and ICE as extensions somehow of Donald Trump. And this is why they get so dangerous. Because then, since Donald Trump is the existential threat to everything in the world, especially our democracy, which I doubt they can define what they mean by that, but then that means that when you are striking out at them, you are either directly or symbolically striking out at the evil Trump. So this stuff just keeps going on. And we have all this slop, this violent slop that goes all over the place, where I mean by that is that it's vague. You just kind of, a lot of violence, and then the reasoning behind it is just scattered. You get the general drift. What I thought was sad about this shooting in Minneapolis was I was listening, and the manifesto, such as it was, had already come out, and people had discussed the YouTube video that had been taken down. And one of the commentators, and I don't think this was the first time it was being done on the news, was a motive had yet to be determined. What do you mean? He's written like several pages of motive about why he's doing this stuff. Now, because it's incoherent and rambling, and once again, slop, it's a sloppy piece of thinking, but it doesn't mean that he's not used that sloppy thinking to turn it to violence. And for people to say that we don't really know, that's because they do really know. And it somehow doesn't fit their agenda. And their agenda is really far away from violence like this, but they're afraid it'll somehow taint it. And ultimately then you get people like, oh, this mayor in Minneapolis. He's just so terrible. You know, people talk about alpha males and then beta males. Well, I think there's a gamma male. That's the third layer of the Greek alphabet, alpha, beta, gamma. So I think he's a gamma male. I can't figure this guy out. I mean, when I was a kid, my G.I. Joes had more manly qualities about them than this guy. And his knowledge about stuff is facile, and he could change it. He's talked for a long time about guns, right? Of course, as we all know, that terrible incident was caused by a firearm, and apparently in his thinking that the person wielding it had very little control over it, which is absurd. But once again, he was talking about these assault weapons and these like this. I think I can get this quote right. He said they have these 30-round clips that go into the magazine to fire many times. It's like, have you ever taken any time? I mean, come on. If you're going to talk about something and want to legislate about it, just, take a minute and learn something about it. You've been talking about stuff like this probably for a long time, but certainly the last couple of years, and you just haven't made any effort whatsoever to learn anything about it. So that kind of recklessness that we see in government when we address these kinds of things. By the way, I think that if you took a smoothbore musket, painted it black, and screwed a pistol grip onto it, that they would say that was an assault weapon. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's what happened. And what's funny about it is at the time that was manufactured, it kind of was. It was most advanced weaponry at the time, and it changes all the time. But my point being is they know so little about it. I don't even know what a musket is. So we have a whole world of people doing things with our money, doing things with our laws, trying to manipulate our culture, who haven't even tried to educate themselves about the things they're trying to manipulate. They just have an idea, and they're going to push everything else out of the way to get it. It's something that you can see coming a mile away, and yet you can't seem to stop it. We're trying to. We've got to elect different people, and we've got to be aware of it. we have to do like Victor Davis Hanson says. People have to stand up and just not take the, not be cowed by this. Oh, well, that's an ism. If you're against that, you're an ist or an ism, whatever you fill in the first part. It's just not true. And people are going to have to decide that they're going to stand up and say, no, I'm going to say this because I think it has to do with merit, or I think it has to do with policy. It doesn't have anything to do with these things you're talking about. You're just trying to hide behind them. So what we're going to do here is we're electing very single or maybe two-issue politicians all over the place. And their issues are like socialism, which they apparently don't understand. The mayor candidate from New York, Zoran the Magnificent, his discussion about socialism isn't socialism. It's, it could be far, far socialism. It's really kind of a version of communism. It's commie-light, as you might say. And it is, once again, sloppy. It's disorganized. If you try and put it together into coherent philosophy, just the remarks he's made don't make any sense. So you take people like that. The culture produces nut jobs because these characters try and manipulate the culture and everything else in a way so that they can stay in positions of authority. And when these cultural icons they use to stay in positions of authority get damaged in some way, they just won't admit it. It's very frustrating. But I can tell you one thing when it comes to their thinking. The thinking of the far left, this is why we were talking about the debt and so forth before, is if you look at nations that have tried the kinds of things that even the semi-moderate Democrats are talking about, they don't work. And we know that. We know that they haven't worked for, every time they've been tried. I can't count how many times some form of socialism, no matter what you call it, has been tried, especially radical socialism and eventually communism. And it just flat doesn't work. Every system that is run by the government is usually monumentally inefficient at best. The issue is that we're willing to accept that for some things because government just kind of stumbles along, but it does provide useful services. And it takes it out of the private sector sometimes where you wouldn't want it to be manipulated by one or two people. Like if you hired, say, Blackwater to police your neighborhood, yeah, they'd probably do a really good job. But you may not like the fact that you're not really in control over them, right? They don't really work for you. You give some money to them and then they're off. This is the reason we band together to do things like police forces, military, things like that. They are necessary. And the fact that they're inefficient most of the time, because that's the way government operates, for various reasons, is something you take along with it. But it doesn't mean you have to have that happen in every single thing. And if you look a little down the road, say, I don't know, Great Britain, United Kingdom, you can see where we're headed. Now, their system's a little different, don't get me wrong, but they're usually several years ahead of us in terms of things that they're trying. So you can kind of get an idea. Also, you can see what's going on to say, look what happened there. Right now, like our debt problem here, Great Britain is just financing, as a government, all sorts of people that aren't producing. For instance, I think off the top of my head, I think that 25% of the working age population between like 18 and 39 is on unemployment in Britain. And they have jobs. There's jobs out there, but they're not getting filled. And 52%, that's the last thing I heard, 52% of the households in Britain consume more government benefits than they pay in taxes. How long can that last? I mean, that's the whole thing about if this were a business, you'd be out of business, right? You can't
give things away. It's like I used to watch Restaurant Impossible, and it was interesting because the guy that was organizing, Robert Irvin, I think, anyway, would come in, and there were several times when he would come in and look at the menu, and there were items on the menu, he would say, you realize that it costs you more to prepare this with ingredients and time than you make off of it. In other words, you lose money every time somebody eats this. And we see a lot of that. And government can get away with that because it just does what? It borrows more and prints more. Here in Colorado, the only thing that protects us is the thin shield of taxpayers' Bill of Rights. And every day it's get hammered by the legislature and the courts. So I don't know how much longer it will last. It gets just eroded, would be a better way to put it. But when you have that kind of tidal wave of people, what happens next is, well, then you get reckless spending because now you have a constituency out there that has real electoral weight. They don't do much else, but you want them to vote, so you just keep it up. And in order to keep it up, you just have to keep borrowing, printing, and so forth. And like all socialism, and Margaret Thatcher, of course, sooner or later you run out of other people's money. That's exactly right. The UK was very, very friendly to business, like to about 2006. A lot of people went to London. They wanted to try and make that another financial capital like New York, and it really is, and starting all sorts of things. And then when we had the 2008 recession, they came in, just like in our country, and imposed all sorts of regulations, all sorts of tests, all sorts of Byzantine rules on the banks. Some of them, a few of them, might have been necessary. But as always, when there's a bad result, we overreact. So now, their whole system is sluggish. They've lost a higher percentage of their population that were wealthy than I think any other place in Europe, because people are just getting out. And their constant proposals for things like wealth taxes and so forth, heck, I think their inheritance tax in the UK, inheritance tax, I think it's 40%. How can you be left anything, unless just a pot of money, if it's goods or a land, it's either product or land or something, you have to sell it, all or part of it, to pay the tax. And that's what's happening. And farming land in Great Britain, because the value of the farmland has gone up, such that the tax on it, if they pass it on to the next generation, is so high, they have to sell it. And so they're actually selling for less value because they have no choice, right? And that's because the government forces it upon them. You pay us the money, or well, I don't have the money, but I have the land. Well, let's sell the land. But if I fire sale the land, which is what's going to happen, everybody knows I have to sell it. I'm not going to get the best price for it. I guess that happens. I don't understand it as a government official. The rules of competition don't apply to me, so I have no idea what you're talking about or value. So that's what happens over there, and it can happen here too. And of course, they have a value-added tax in Europe, which is each transition through the system of delivery, manufacturing, and so forth has a tax as you add value to the product. And then, of course, you have a sales tax on top of that. Also, once again, Britain, just like it was here for a while, they're talking about a wealth tax. Now, there's some absurdities in economics, and wealth taxes is one of them. The idea that you can tax someone on their static wealth, and you think that's going to work out, is just ludicrous. First of all, if I'm going to tax you on the potential amount of money that you have because you own something that's valuable, how are we going to agree on the value of it? I mean, you're not putting up for sale. So someone's going to have to come in and assess its value. Of course, the government will want it to be assessed as high as possible because they get more tax. And as you go on with this craziness, people realize that they get taxed on things that have value, but then they don't get it back. The answer they get is, if you do this, they say, well, what happens if the next year the value goes down? Well, that's when you pay less tax. Wait a second. I lost money, right? I paid you for a certain amount of tax on a certain amount of capital. And now you're telling me that because the price has gone down, the only recourse I have is to be happy that I don't pay more tax this year. Yeah, they're not a partner in this. They're not like, oh, okay, yeah, well, you took this amount last year, so we'll deduct. No, there's none of that. And, of course, once again, we go back to the idea of who decides what value is. That's a tremendous problem in systems like that. But as these financial situations of the nation states, like our national debt, begin to fail, these kinds of ideas come to the fore, because the idea of cutting back spending and, having a problem with some congressman's district because you're not spending money counting lily pads or something, yeah, that's the problem. They're not going to vote for that. So the spending continues to go on. And government grows to do what? Well, collect more money. And how do you collect more money? Well, you have more laws. More laws essentially, more authority, more power. Historically, and right now, if you look around the world, every government that is funding businesses, in other words, is partnering up with businesses and trying to do this and that, the bigger the government, the more poverty they seem to have. The more Byzantine the government, the more poverty they have. The more free the country, less poverty is found. That's an axiom. I think you just look around. Freedom to compete advances. Government taking money and doling it out to people doesn't advance anything. It's probably retrograde. So you should think about these things like the debt, where that's going, because what it's doing, it's going to power this kind of craziness. And I brought up this shooting, which makes me ill, because that's the most violent cutting edge of that chaos. But the desire to keep funding these ideas, to keep power by votes, essentially, will eventually drive every government towards authoritarianism. That's why they have to be reset from time to time. I think we're at a reset time. I'm just hoping that President Trump can do it. The deep state's...
Hi, folks. Thanks for listening. Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickwagnershow.com. Both of them take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.